All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Samir Vazdev from Facebook's Social Impact Partnerships team, and we're really excited for those of you who are joining us on this session today to get some unique perspectives from the tech sector on advancing the data revolution. This session is TA 2.14, just to make sure you're in the right place that you intended. The name of this session is Private Sector Innovation in a Post-Pandemic World. Now, before we get started, it's worth flagging that, as you might know, a lot of time has gone into designing this conference, and this session in particular has been in the works for almost 2 years. At the time, and when this was revised about a year ago, the term post-pandemic did seem feasible for around now. Obviously, we're seeing that the conditions are far from post-pandemic in many parts of the world. We want to make sure we acknowledge that. That said, I think a lot of the messages that we'll be covering today will be just as relevant in either context. So today we're here to talk with some leaders from the private tech sector and from UN agencies, all about the role of the tech sector to integrate non-commercial data resources in the data revolution. A little bit about what to expect. Today, we'll have a few introductory remarks from myself, and then we'll turn it right over to our panelists who will share some insights about their work to advance the data revolution at their organizations for about 5 minutes each. After that, we'll have a discussion of panelists. We prepared some questions in advance, and I encourage you throughout the entire session, please drop your questions in the Whova app. I'm checking it right here, and we'll be sure if we have time to raise those questions to these distinguished panelists. So why are we here? We're here because all of us believe that tech companies have a responsibility, right, to contribute to the SDGs and the global goals and the progress that they represent. So here at Facebook, for instance, our mission is to give people the power to build communities and bring the world closer together. But we really care about what kind of communities people are building, communities that are safe, healthy, just, equitable, that fight for equal opportunities, climate justice, and openness. In other words, communities that serve the global goals. And there are countless of ways that the tech sector can and does accelerate progress on these goals. So at Facebook, for instance, we've achieved net zero emissions in our global operations and plan to reach net zero emissions for our value chain by 2030. And I know other tech firms represented here have similar ambitions. But we're here today to zoom in on one specific way that the tech sector can partner with global impact organizations to advance the global goals. And that's by fostering the use of non-commercial, non-traditional, and privacy-preserving data to advance decision-making that leads to progress on these goals. Now, we're not going to spend too much time today on why this is important. I think all of you in the audience are here because you're familiar with the reasons, right? The data gaps that we're trying to fill and the urgent need to make data-informed decisions in our work to advance impact in the world. Instead, we'll focus more on the how, tactics, strategy, examples that come into play when safely sharing non-traditional data with decision makers, influencers, researchers, nonprofits, and others as well. So that's really going to be the focus today is the how. So to summarize, we have a few goals today. The first is to discuss practical examples, incentives, challenges for non-commercial data sharing to support the goals. We'll also discuss the role of the tech sector in partnering with different organizations to advance digital transformation. And we'd like to leave you, the audience, with specific resources that you can access from the tech sector and UN agencies to use data to advance the SDGs. So please stay tuned, both in the discussion section and in the pre-prepared remarks from our panelists for specific resources that you can look at. Now, another implicit goal here is to continue an ongoing dialogue. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but it's worth recognizing that we know that showing up at a moment like this doesn't mean we're achieving the SDGs or advancing progress on data for SDGs alone. We're here for the long haul through 2030 and beyond. Last year, we featured at the mini virtual world data forum, and throughout this year, we've been working with the Swiss Federal Statistics Office on their Road to Bern agenda and their pre-events. You can check those sessions out on YouTube to follow up to see how this conversation has evolved in the past year and a half. But of course, again, these gatherings are not the main way that the tech sector manifests our impact on the SDGs and the data revolution. It's about what we and our partners are achieving together. And that's what this panel is all about and why we have these brilliant perspectives from these different organizations that you can see here on the slide. LinkedIn, Salesforce, PayPal, Facebook will give us some perspectives from the tech sector, and then some speakers from the World Bank and UN OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data Exchange will help us ground our comments in real world impact and case studies of partnerships. These are our distinguished panelists. We're so excited that they're here to join us. and to share their perspectives with you. I will spare you their bios. I know you can read them all on the app. And we might turn it over now to our first panelist, Laura, to introduce herself and share some remarks. I'll stop sharing my screen in the meantime so you can see her face. And in the meantime, while she and others are speaking, please, as a reminder, submit your questions in the audience Q&A in Whova. I'll be sure to keep an eye out for that. But without further ado, our first distinguished guest, over to you, Laura.
Thanks so much, Samir, and thanks everybody for joining this hybrid event. We were just talking before the recording started that we hope to all see you in person in 2022. My name is Laura McGorman, and I lead a team called Data for Good at Facebook. It is a team actually that's been in existence for 4.5 years. We started with a humble set of objectives around natural disaster response, and we launched a set of tools many years ago called disaster maps. We were hearing very loudly from the humanitarian sector that if we could share better data on evacuations from GPS traces, if we could share information on whether or not cellular networks were operating at diminished capacity during something like a hurricane or a typhoon, that really could transform humanitarian response in the context of things like earthquakes and hurricanes, and in the US, particularly during wildfires. In 2019, the program moved towards actually using the same set of inputs in many ways, mobility data being sort of a key component of our program, to try to make impact on public health. Because our program had grown at that time to about 100 bilateral partners around the world, we actually heard from people working in infectious disease response that the same information that you could use to better understand whether or not people were moving away from danger is the same kind of information you'd want to understand kind of an inverse set of problems. So what's the contact rate between populations when there's a measles outbreak or when you're trying to forecast something like flu? So we launched a set of tools called disease prevention maps in 2019 that were meant to address that. Now, of course, in May 2019, we were all at the World Health Assembly talking about disease prevention mapping. Little did we know there was a global infectious disease pandemic headed our way. And that meant by early 2020, we really wanted and hopefully could hit the ground running with a bunch of tools for COVID-19 response. And so I think one thing that is an opportunity for reflection looking back on the program for the past couple of years is that now the Data for Good programs across tech companies, of which we'll hear many today, have been operating for some period of time. It does provide a foundation for a far greater amount of impact than we've ever had. I think a lot of data sharing programs unfortunately start right when a problem occurs. And what we found by working through natural disaster responses, that's already too late. You can't be scoping a new data product when there's a hurricane going on. You can't be scoping a new data product when a pandemic is already running rampant through countries and through counties across the world. And so one thing that I really do think is important is that as we look towards the post-pandemic world, whenever that is, or as we look even more towards long-term coronavirus control, how do we continue to build? How do we continue to grow upon the teams that are already working on these issues, have already learned a great deal about what works and what doesn't work, and really capitalize on those learnings? And so a few examples that I think are really important to share here is that COVID-19 response in one way was a really important example of how crystallized, very clear use cases that tech companies can act on very quickly lead to greater impact. And so in the case of Facebook, overnight, we created a new set of tooling called movement range maps in the early days of the pandemic. And this is similar to Google Community Mobility Reports, similar to a mobility product that Apple has. And that's another example, by the way, that it's really important sometimes for all tech companies to contribute even to the same problem because we have different data sets, we represent different populations, and sometimes our modeling is a little bit different. And what we found is that movement range maps, through our partnership with Humanitarian Data Exchange, has been downloaded over 30,000 times since we launched it last year. And it's been used across dozens of countries to better understand how social distancing and stay-at-home orders have actually been taken up by populations, or whether or not different policies needed to be put in place to achieve better stay-at-home adherence. So these have been used by ONS in the UK to monitor whether or not the national population was adhering to stay-at-home policies there, by a series of governors and the national government in Mexico. And just recently in Indonesia, CSIS there published a really interesting paper that found not only that our mobility data could be useful for stay-at-home monitoring, but also that it was predictive of local economic activity, that you can use our mobility data that was originally planned for just coronavirus response monitoring as a metric to forecast local GDP growth, which again is a really fascinating and I think consequential finding. And so I think that as we look to the next 5, 10 years of sort of data sharing for public good, I think we have a really good opportunity to learn upon, to build upon the lessons learned and grow our impact as sort of a global community. And I really do think of the work that we're doing as hugely, hugely collaborative. Everyone on the call today, I consider a partner. We work super closely with OCHA to get our data out. We work super, super closely with Holly and team at the World Bank to make sure it's in the hands of the right people at the global multilaterals. And I think that we're only going to have more impact as we continue to grow as sort of a community of data sharing for public good practitioners. And one thing that I'll say, in addition to really working on the monitoring and adherence work, is that as we move towards more and more questions of vaccine distribution, this is something our team is really dedicated to being helpful on. And so something we launched actually alongside the United Nations General Assembly was a new set of maps on health facility travel times and service areas. Because we've heard from all of our public health collaborators, particularly in developing countries, that understanding simple questions like catchment areas of a known health facility is really, really hard. And understanding how hard it is to get to the nearest health facility is also very difficult to do. Typically, it's just forecasted by the presence of roads, and then you extrapolate based on that. So that's a new data set that's brand new, that if you're a humanitarian or nonprofit counterpart watching, I really encourage you to email our team at dataforgood@fb.com, because we want to make sure that that's uniquely useful to people who are working to deliver vaccines in low-income environments right now. And I will pass it back to Samir. Thanks so much.
Cheers. Thank you, Laura, for those remarks. I think the note on collaboration is really well taken. That's really why we're here today, is to hear from these different teams with budding, existing, or potential data for good programs and how they could coordinate and build off of each other. For those tuning in online or on the Whova app, over in the chat window, I've also added the link to the Data for Good website, where you can learn more about the Facebook Data for Good program. But without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our colleague Rosita from PayPal. So Rosita, I'll pass over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Samir. Really grateful for the opportunity to join this conversation. To illustrate the potential of collaboratives with the private sector, I'll offer 3 examples that advance SDG 16, which is on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And I'll offer a quick look ahead by sharing 3 things that I'm excited about, learning about, and thinking about. Just a quick word for those of you not familiar with PayPal. PayPal is a fintech, and our mission is to democratize financial services so that people and families can improve their financial health, and so small businesses and merchants of all sizes can pursue economic opportunity. We've remained at the forefront of the digital payment revolution for about 20 years by leveraging technology to make financial services and commerce more convenient, affordable, and secure. And as a result, our platform is empowering more than 400 million consumers and merchants in more than 200 markets to join and thrive in the global economy. Now, top among the contributors to our current state is that we have one of the most sophisticated private financial crime units in the world. And our global financial crime and customer protection team is comprised of former public prosecutors, law enforcement agents, and data scientists that are tackling financial crime 24/7. We work closely with regulators and law enforcement all around the world to identify and address potential threats using all the resources and data that uniquely are being produced on our payments platform. And so it's from this context that I was going to offer 3 examples of partnerships that we've done with civil society to have outcomes towards SDG 16. So the first one, we partnered with Polaris, a leader in combating human trafficking, and we funded the creation of a financial intelligence unit. We pitched in our financial and subject matter expertise to leverage intelligence from the US National Human Trafficking Hotline and other sources to interrupt trafficker cash flows and to enable prosecutions for financial crimes, including money laundering. It's been an incredible privilege to collaborate with Polaris to find new and innovative ways for the anti-money laundering community at large to recognize financial transactions that are red flags for human trafficking. Second, we funded a 3-year research initiative with Northeastern University Center on Crime and Community Resilience and the University of Chicago's Crime Lab. In this project, we researched the money movement associated with illegal buying and selling of firearms for the purposes of identifying financial indicators of that activity. We were actually quite surprised to learn that this type of research had never been undertaken before. And again, what was most exciting was not us getting better at our craft, but the public good opportunity that this work will better enable all financial institutions, not just PayPal, as well as the law enforcement agencies, to identify and stop illegal firearm trafficking. And the final example, we recently in July announced a partnership with the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, to launch a research effort to better understand how extremist and hate movements in the US are leveraging financial platforms to fund their criminal activity. In addition to extremist and anti-government organizations, the initiative will focus, on actors and networks spreading and profiting from all forms of hate and bigotry against any community. So looking ahead, 3 things. First thing I'm excited about is a commitment we just made in June as part of the UN's Generation Equality Forum on how over the next 5 years, PayPal is going to be making particular efforts around advancing gender equality. And one of those 7 commitments that we announced was to advance gender data, and it will include a partnership with TA2.14 that we're excited about. Second, what I'm learning about, including this afternoon, we are having an internal learning session for employees at PayPal on data equity. We are thrilled to sharpen our skills in this area as well as apply it to our work, regardless of what team we're sitting on in the company. And third, what I'm thinking about is actually something that Laura already mentioned, which is what could we adopt as a data community and adapt from the rapid response community about data preparedness. And what I'm talking about is, as we all reflected and heard from Laura's remarks, is COVID has taught us a lot, and so has the recent climate-related disasters that seem to be happening on a monthly and biweekly basis. It's clear how important it is to prepare in advance those playbooks, to have the infrastructure in place already so that data can be leveraged as part of these rapid responses, regardless of if it's climate-driven or man-made. And what this means for me, in my reflection, welcome the thoughts of others during the Q&A, is we just have to hurry up and put in place that technology that will enable the interoperability. We have to architect in advance and now those partnerships across both the sources and uses of data, and also have our lawyers work out those legal frameworks now and in advance. So thank you, Samir, over to you.
Thanks, Rosita. It's really meaningful that you end with a note of the urgency here. I mean, in many cases, we have the blueprint and the steps of the infrastructure, the examples, the case studies in place. And it's a matter perhaps of replicating through conversations like this, hopefully, where we can learn from our peers. Before we turn over to Andrew Means next, I just want to say hello and express my envy to those of you who are in the room. I see a few folks there. We all wish we were there with you. I did want to flag that as you consider any questions, even though there are mics in the room, since we don't have anyone there, all questions from the audience will be submitted through the Whova app. So please make sure while you're listening in that you look in on the app and submit your questions there so we can make sure to interact with you. Again, wish you were there in person, and thanks for joining. Without further ado, over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Samir, and hello, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Andrew Means. I'm with Salesforce, where I lead our global impact data strategy. And I think it's actually great to be going after what Rosita just talked about and really teeing up the idea of how do we put into place the technologies and that we need in these kinds of like emergency responses and things like that. Because at Salesforce, we're actually a little bit unique to some of my peers on this call as a data company, right? Because while we support many organizations in their own data collection efforts, their own analytics efforts, their own use of data efforts, we actually don't view ourselves as having, many data resources to give, like some of my partners on this call are, right? So our focus is really around how do we help empower and organizations of all kinds to use data effectively and well. Our focus is really on that kind of supporting of better collection, collaboration, and utilization of data. And in particular, I'm focused on an area that we call impact management. Really around like how do we help organizations change what they're doing today to improve the impact that they'll be having tomorrow by learning from what they did yesterday, right? So creating this kind of continuous improvement impact muscle around data and evidence. And we absolutely believe that data and evidence should be a primary driver of impact organizations, regardless of whether they be companies or nonprofits or education institutions or governments. All of these organizations are increasingly being asked to be held accountable and being held accountable for their non-financial performance, for the impact that they're having in the world. And so we believe that they should have the tools and the insights and the data to do this work well. And so we call that space impact management. And the way that we work with organizations, again, whether they be companies that are trying to do this work, nonprofits, governments, healthcare organizations, we work with them through consultations, strategic evidence planning, and solutioning to really help them be able to collect, analyze, and utilize data effectively to drive their mission and their impact forward. And we really seek to make these tools as accessible as possible. So we provide these through cohorts of like peer-based learning groups where we gather organizations of similar issue areas or working on similar causes together to build these muscles collaboratively and collectively. And then we also offer these things free via our online training platform, Trailhead. So for folks that are interested in this kind of impact management space, and we try to provide as many resources as possible freely online for organizations to use. But again, like our focus is really on helping organizations use this technology to further their missions. But we also, in addition to kind of taking the technology that we've developed for the commercial sector and applying it towards these kind of social impact goals, we're increasingly developing technology for social impact goals. So for example, as the pandemic hit, we developed Vaccine Cloud, which was a solution to help organizations manage vaccine distribution. And we've partnered with nonprofits, governments, multilaterals around the world to get Vaccine Cloud into their hands. And this is a solution that's going to be utilized far beyond after this pandemic's over to support vaccine distribution broadly of all kinds. And similarly, we're increasingly making investments into sustainability through Sustainability Cloud, which is really focused right now on carbon management, but will expand greatly beyond this. This is an area that we see a lot of regulatory changes occurring. We think that the movement around ESG data and reporting is important. And we're continuing to really focus on, again, how can we help organizations of all kinds meet these new kinds of reporting requirements? And we do this, again, in a very collaborative approach. So we started an effort called Impacting Together, where we're bringing together a variety of stakeholders from ESG, impact investing, and monitoring and evaluation from the social sector, to talk about like what we can learn from each other, how we can expand each other's toolkits, and bring data resources and data capabilities to the table so that organizations of all kinds can really participate as these, this new kind of ESG impact economy continues to emerge. So when we think about partnerships around data, we are really focused on the capacity building end of the spectrum. So like the data resources that my partners on this call are talking about are so absolutely critical. And where we see our role in this ecosystem is helping the capacity of organizations to receive and kind of utilize this data in their operational work. And so we're focused on the tool building end of the data economy. But we are increasingly begin to explore the role that we can play in developing value-added analytics and insights within these kinds of products. And so, next best actions for case management systems and things of that nature. And so that, because we recognize that, organizations are looking for greater insight from their data. And so we're continuing to explore there. But when I think about kind of the collaboration and the opportunity for public-private partnership, I think on this call, we represent a really great spectrum, right? Because you need the data providers. There are absolutely companies around the world, and that's included. There are data assets that we have that we make available. But we need, not just the data providers, we need the tool builders. We need the folks that are helping connect data to business value and operations. And that's really where we at Salesforce see our focus is on how do we help empower and enable organizations to use this kind of data well. So Samir, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome, thanks, Andrew. Your remarks remind me of the World Development Report that the World Bank issued in 2016, which focused on digital development and called for, reminded us that it's not just about the digital assets that we contribute, but also the analog elements of a community or an ecosystem. And it feels like a lot of the impact management work that you do is precisely around that maybe the soft side and the ecosystem side around this, which is really important. So for me, the more I learn about what work Salesforce is doing, it's a reminder that the role of tech companies, like you alluded to, is much more than just maybe I don't want to say merely, but sharing data assets, which of course is non-trivial, but perhaps can be a role in the ecosystem side too. Now, to round up our whirlwind tour of representatives from tech companies, we'll turn it over to Nate from LinkedIn. Nate, over to you. Oh, Nate, if you could unmute yourself real quick, thanks.
Had to be one of us on the panel that forgot to unmute, right? Volunteers tribute for the rest. All right. So thanks for having me, Samir. Thanks for organizing the content on the panel. I was remarking before. I feel like
Nate, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to make sure if you're trying to share a screen, we don't see it here.
Yeah, no, not quite yet.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a minute. Always good to check. So I've learned a lot from the fellow panelists. I think the discussion recently on capacity building and data sharing is important. I think both are tactics that LinkedIn hopes to employ in participating in data collaboratives and public-private partnerships. So let me share a few slides quickly, and I won't spend a ton of time going through the material since we want to get to the Q&A and have more of a discussion. But I want to start by introducing LinkedIn's data. So talking about the assets that we're making available and the source from which they come. So we have at LinkedIn this concept known as economic graph, which is a way of describing the way that information is organized. And as you'll see, the economic graph has a couple important data elements. So you'll see we have professional profiles on the site, company representatives, jobs, skills that members use to describe themselves, and that employers use to describe job opportunities. Schools which provide those skills and knowledge, and the subtotal of edges on the graph you'll see is significant. So when we talk about the data that LinkedIn has to share, a lot of the applications derive from this economic graph, and so we'll talk about a few of the applications in light of partnerships that we've developed, and then I think talk about an exciting new partnership model that we've entered into that I'm hoping you'll hear more from Holly, the development data partnership. So getting into a couple of the applications really quickly. The difference in some of the other panelists that have talked about their data assets in LinkedIn is that the data that LinkedIn has, really governments have been collecting since long before. Governments were the original creators of occupational taxonomies and skill taxonomies. They've collected information from surveys, from administrative data. In the US, we have the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's a national statistical body in every country around the world. So LinkedIn's data we see as more of a complement to those traditional data sources rather than a brand new set of data. But there are some advantages in the data that we make available. So for one, the data is global. A lot of the data that government collects is limited or stops at the border or jurisdiction of that country or city or state or province. By design, LinkedIn is a global network. The data breaks down quite easily across locations, industry, functions, job family. We can also break the data down by gender. And when we talk about some of the data sets that we've made available and that we plan to make available, we'll also talk about our plan to break data down along green skill and green occupation dimensions so that we can start to inform changes that we see in the economy due to climate. Another example of the value of where we think LinkedIn data can be complementary to traditional sources is that it is real time. When members add new skills or they add new occupations to their profile, we're able to aggregate those changes up in real time and be able to see how the economy is changing vis-a-vis those changes that members and employers are making to their profile on LinkedIn. The other thing is that we can trend data over time. So we can see the growth of the skill. If it starts in 2016 or 17, we can see how it propagates through an occupation, through a job family, through a sector, or through a geographical border. So a couple of different advantages, but the key highlight for us here is that we see our data as being complementary to traditional data sources. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we do see certain advantages in our data sets versus what government has access to right now. So when we look at applications of LinkedIn data in partner institutions in the past, and a lot of these do get into direct application for the SDGs, we've used data to study the global gender gap. So you can see the rate of acquisition of skills across male and female genders and see how that trends over time. We've worked to understand how skills can transfer from one job to the next, especially when COVID hit. We saw that there were a lot of professionals in the service sector that no longer had jobs. And so the question the government wants to address is, what can these professionals do if they've been dislocated from jobs in COVID? Where can they go next? Instead of just waiting around for their job to come back, what's the best application of their skills in the meantime? And so I worked with a couple of different partners to understand how skills can transfer across occupations. And then finally, we look at networks and trade flows. So professionals on LinkedIn are connected. So we can look at the strength of those connections across borders, and we can evaluate how networks influence trade. This is the example with the World Bank. Other applications for network data exist. This is one that we did a couple of years ago with the World Bank. So one of the things that we're excited about recently is in April of this year, we entered into the Development Data Partnership, which is an organization that includes a couple different multilateral institutions. And I'm hoping that Holly's going to talk about this next. So with the Development Data Partnership, this is important to LinkedIn because in the past, all of our relationships with multilateral partners had been bilateral, meaning that we needed to do a lot of work to approach the organization, to help them understand LinkedIn's data assets, for them to help LinkedIn understand their research priorities. And with the Development Data Partnership, the model has a lot of advantages that do away with some of those, the operational friction that we would get from those bilateral partnerships. So I'll very quickly describe some of the data that we've made available through the partnership and its applications. And then we'll talk a little bit about advantages and partner benefits. And when we get into the Q&A, if there are questions about what we've learned from bilateral partnerships or this multilateral model in the Development Data Partnership, I'd welcome them. I feel like we've learned quite a lot in the last 6 months, especially thanks to Holly and some of her peers. So LinkedIn hiring rate, skill similarity, career transitions, you can see on the slide here. I won't go too much into the explanation because it's given on the slide. Korean skills and jobs is a data set that we're very excited about, and we expect to launch in the next couple of weeks through the development data portal, hopefully in time for COP26. So these are the data sets that we are making available to the partnership. And again, some of the benefits that we see in doing this. We no longer have to coordinate single partnerships. We're still very willing to do that, but this takes away a lot of the work involved in partnership management. In terms of impact, what we really want to see is LinkedIn's data being used to inform policy that relates to the SDGs. And we think that we can do this through partnerships better than we can on our own. So we're looking for great case studies of the partnership use of LinkedIn data, similar to the case studies we generated with individual partners in the past. The other one that I'll highlight here, I won't go through all of them, but I do want to touch on capacity building. This is one that Andrew mentioned, and I think it's really important. There are a lot of economists, folks that work on projects within these multilateral partners that didn't necessarily study to become data scientists and then join their policy institution. So to the extent that we can provide not just the data, but also the skills that staff at these partner institutions need to interpret the data, to analyze it, to apply it, I think that we'll go further together with capacity building and data hand in hand. We've started with sharing data, but I think the next step for us in the partnership is to try and build more capacity, which we hope to do through some of the learning and course offerings that we have that speak to data science professionals and their skill needs. So Samir, I'll leave it there, but looking forward to the Q&A after this.
Terrific. Thank you, Nate. Just a brief reflection. I think I really appreciate how specific and tangible your presentation was, leading to specific assets. We have a question coming in. I might quickly throw back at you. Is to what extent are these data sets that you shared readily available for free? Is there a cost associated?
No, there's no cost. Sharing the data isn't a commercial objective for us. I think that the limiting factor is we make them available through the Development Data Partnership right now. That's our primary vehicle for sharing data. And so staff in those 5 partner institutions have access to the data. They can send proposals. Once they send a proposal, we agree to it, then we send the data to them. So right now it is limited to those 5 institutions, but I hope that we can expand from there.
Terrific. Thank you. And Frank, that's your question there. I hope that answers that. It might be worth mentioning that the Facebook Data for Good program makes some data sets freely available online publicly for anyone to access on the Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is my attempt at a segue to Kareem. I would love to turn to you. I think I'm mixing up the order a bit. Sorry to catch you by surprise, Kareem. But we'll turn it over to you now to take us from perspectives outside of the tech sector, but clearly working very closely with the tech sector. So over to you, Kareem, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Samir, and thank you to all of my really excellent co-panelists. It's tough to present after all of you have already shared so many great insights. Until very recently, I was the partnerships manager for the Center for Humanitarian Data, which was established by the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, to increase the use and impact of data in humanitarian response. I've just recently transitioned to a new role as a program coordinator for the Connecting Business Initiative, which was established by OCHA and the UN Development Program to strategically engage with the private sector before, during, and after emergencies. As such, it's fairly safe to say that I'm a big believer in the importance of partnerships between the tech sector, civil society, governments, and humanitarian development agencies. And I've really seen firsthand the power of these types of partnerships to advance digital transformation, make humanitarian response faster and more efficient, and contribute to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. For the humanitarian and development community, business as usual is simply no longer an option. Climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and complex political emergencies have driven humanitarian needs to their highest level in decades. For the first time in my lifetime, extreme poverty has increased, life expectancies are falling, and food insecurity has nearly doubled. No organization can meet, let alone end these needs on its own. And if we don't work collectively, we risk not just failure to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but an unraveling of the last 40 years of development. At the Center for Humanitarian Data, we have identified 27 core data sets that are needed to inform humanitarian decision-making and increase the speed and effectiveness of humanitarian response. We need accurate, up-to-date data on things like the locations and status of health and education facilities, granular information about food prices and malnutrition rates, and the conditions of roads, airports, and other critical infrastructure. We've been putting out an annual report for the last 2 years, the State of Open Humanitarian Data, that highlights the availability and completeness of data in the world's most vulnerable countries. And the results may be surprising. Even after years of engagement, we're only at about 50% data completeness, and a full 28% of our critical data categories have no data at all. This lack of available, timely data greatly affects our ability to respond to crises and advance the SDGs. The challenges of our time demand that we identify creative approaches to integrating multiple data sources, including non-traditional data sources. At the center, we built a COVID-19 data explorer early on in the pandemic that integrated more than 60 data sets from 24 providers to help policymakers make better decisions about how to allocate aid to those most in need. However, none of those data sources were from the private sector, and I'm quite sure that the tool would have been massively improved and made more useful if we were able to integrate those contributions. At the same time, the humanitarian system is increasingly making a shift toward anticipatory action, in which we try to mitigate the effects of a crisis before it occurs. If we have reliable data indicators that show, for example, that a river is about to flood, we would like to be able to engage before the flood takes place to protect the lives and livelihoods of the people who may be affected. We've recently entered into a partnership with a company that's not here today, Google, to help us integrate new sources of data into predictive models that can trigger humanitarian interventions before an expected shock takes place. We'll also be receiving additional capacity in the form of Google Data Fellows who can help us to understand and use flood forecasting tools. There's a similar example that I can share just from Facebook. I know that Facebook has the high resolution population density maps, and these have been used by a number of NGOs, including World Vision, an NGO in Ghana, to help identify population clusters with no existing water treatment facilities, including villages that may not even appear on official maps. These partnerships have led to the establishment of new water treatment facilities that are providing clean water to over, well, in the case of World Vision, almost 50 million beneficiaries. It's an enormous number of people. So while the opportunities are clear, there are also a number of challenges that we must address. Specifically, we have to ensure that we approach these partnerships with an emphasis on data responsibility. We have to work to ensure that these partnerships are grounded in the safe, ethical, and effective management of personal and non-personal data. There's enormous scope for us to work together more closely on a wide range of issues and with a wide range of organizations, including many of the people who are here with me on this panel today, in order to transform the way the humanitarian system works and protect fragile development gains of the recent decades. There's no time to waste. So I'm going to stop here because I have a number of things that I hope we can continue to share in the Q&A part of this, but thank you very much.
Terrific. Thanks, Karima. And thank you for mentioning a really important topic that, although the others didn't mention, is equally important, which is the safe and privacy preserving sharing of data. For those who are interested in, at least on Facebook side, on privacy preservation, the website that I shared in the chat of the Data for Good program can share a lot of details about various privacy preservation tactics that go into the development of any of these data sets. So that is really important. And thank you, Kareem, for flagging that. Now, to round out our roadshow here, we have the inimitable Holly from the World Bank. Thanks for sharing your screen, and I'll pass it over to you.
Neat. Thank you so much, Samir. And it's really neat to see people in the live audience too, those intrepid ones who came. So hello and thank you. As all of the panelists have mentioned, data partnerships are really useful for international development. And as Nate especially hinted, they are really hard to achieve in practice, especially at scale. So we founded the Development Data Partnership to overcome traditional legal, technical, and governance hurdles to data sharing. So I thought I'd give you a little show and tell about how the partnership works. At the heart of our program is our legal framework. The World Bank has so far signed a MOU with the IMF, Inter-American Development Bank, UNDP, and OECD. And this MOU enables us to collaborate on data sharing agreements with the private sector. It establishes a mechanism for us to share the costs associated with data management. And it designates the World Bank as the secure data manager for the program. And together, we have crafted a standard data license agreement, which companies can sign with all member organizations on behalf of all of our staff, as opposed to the past where these were all one-on-one engagements. And with this foundation, we have signed pro bono data sharing agreements with more than 20 data partners, including some on this call, covering a range of data types and sectors. How do we link agreements to projects? Once agreements are signed, we post them on our internal marketplace where staff can explore opportunities. And then once staff have picked the data sets for their project, they submit a proposal. The proposals are received by our data partners who use their dashboard to approve use cases. And this is really important. It is through these proposals we can automatically link the use cases to our legal agreements, ensure all team members confirm their understanding of the data terms of use, track metrics like impacted sectors and SDGs, and track progress towards our ultimate goal, production of data goods, replicable solutions to public sector challenges. After a proposal is approved, we can transfer the data to the approved team members. And behind the scenes, we have built a robust IT architecture to manage hopefully seamless data ingest, storage, access management, and processing on behalf of not just bank staff, but staff of all the international organization partners. And sometimes our colleagues need a little help to get started. We host a data desk that links teams to the data they need and also maintains a data documentation portal with details about how to use the data, as well as code and project examples. After projects are completed, code is posted on our data documentation portal, and case studies are posted on our external website so that teams can constantly build on each other's work. So far, we have nearly 200 projects in our system supporting 13 sustainable development goals. For example, a World Bank team used Ookla internet speed data to understand the digital divide in the Ukraine to inform broadband investments. An IDB team used VeriSet geolocation data to understand changes in movement patterns in Lima during the pandemic to inform the redesign of public markets, which I thought was very creative. An IMF team used Esri data products to help governments understand the link between climate change and economic indicators. And another World Bank team used Facebook and Mapbox data to analyze the accessibility of health facilities in the Philippines and in Indonesia. So just to give you an idea of the range. We are governed by a board with leadership from each of the international development organizations, and we also have a secretariat that manages the day-to-day and legal and data coordination working groups. If you are interested in learning more about the partnership, because there is a lot more, or about how to engage, please go to our website and send us a note. We would really love to hear from you, especially this audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Holly. What an astonishing look into the inner workings of a complex partnership like this. That slide that you shared showing the schematic of how different players are interacting in that whole ecosystem is intimidating, but it does prove that this is why it might look like rocket science is achievable, and it's something that could be replicable in other contexts too. So thanks, Holly, for sharing that. So this ends the first part of the session, which are these 5-minute remarks from these panelists. So huge thank you for these panelists for doing really a disservice and trying to summarize their entire programs in just a few minutes. For those in the audience who want to learn more, please reach out to us in the Q&A. We have a question coming in that we'll get to in a second. But until then, because it seems like there's not too much going on in the Q&A, we'll have a bit of time now to do some discussion questions. So I'm going to see if I can multitask and share my screen real quick with an awkward pause, perhaps. Here we go. And we've got a few discussion questions to frame us here. I hope you can see that screen. Let me know if not, but we might take it off or jump off right away with that third discussion prompt here. Now, the goal here again is, this is a very unique opportunity to hear from the perspectives of these tech companies and their multilateral collaborators here at the World Data Forum. So we're trying to encompass a lot here in these three discussion prompts. We'll dive into the third one first. I'll invite Laura and then Rosita to tackle this one, which is, what are the enabling factors that are really important or are key to successful private sector data for SDG collaborations? Laura, I might pass to you if you have any remarks. If not, you can pass to Rosita.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we say in the Data for Good community over and over again is clear use cases. But I think one thing that our program has learned is it's clear use cases from a chorus of practitioners working in the humanitarian and academic space. So I think a lesson learned from the early days of our program is that we would often have conversations with one or two nonprofits or one academic, and people would create a set of applications that maybe were uniquely useful to their organization or were considered academically engaging to their particular research agenda. But what was really helpful for us to learn, quite frankly, through the COVID-19 pandemic was that when you have a chorus of data users who are asking for the same thing, it really helps you refine what you're doing, and it helps you ensure you're going to have impact from the get-go. So again, using the example of movement range maps, in the early days of the pandemic, it didn't matter if you were an academic researcher, if you were a public health official working at the state, city, or national level, everyone wanted to understand what was the adherence to non-pharmaceutical interventions, things like staying at home and whether or not people were wearing masks. And so in the case of staying at home, we built a set of maps that helped better understand basically whether or not people were staying put in a particular location at a population level, or whether or not people were still moving around a lot based on opt-in mobility data shared through location services. And then we also included a bunch of questions on mask wearing through our massive COVID-19 Trends and Impact Survey, which is a collaboration with Carnegie Mellon and University of Maryland. And both of those pieces of data have been adopted by thousands of organizations working in nearly 100 countries around the world. And so for me, it's great to hear what would be helpful to one or two people, but way better to hear what would be helpful to hundreds and thousands of people. And so looking forward to future data products that we want to build, I certainly hope to be able to hear from the chorus in the future as a way to really ensure scale from the onset of your program.
Thanks, Laura. It reminds me of the 100 Questions initiative that the New York University's GovLab came up with to try to get some consensus throughout these high-level problem statements or these widespread problem statements. Rosita, any remarks from you on this third prompt here?
Sure. I think these would apply really for any partnership relationship. First is just transparency around each stakeholder's incentives. I think for the private sector, the opportunity of learning and having impact is one that's clear, and it would be helpful, getting the help of the partner and making sure that can be measured in a credible way. I think the second is just really clear roles and responsibilities and a timeline. Particularly on the timeline point, having action forcing moments like, the example I mentioned, the Generation Equality Forum that we had over the summer, having these kind of moments where things will be announced really creates that deadline to make things go faster that could normally take a long time. I mentioned lawyers. I could not underline how important the lawyers are in terms of what type of lawyers they are. You really want those who have this, let's figure it out mindset, as opposed to the no mindset. And finally, I would say the power of FOMO, or fear of missing out, can be your friend, I think, in forming these partnerships. And that, whether it's a competitor or just another private sector company, being able to point to others as examples that you're not alone, you're not first, this is not, anything, it's not rocket science, it can be done, I think can reduce at least certainly the anxieties from the private sector side. And so for those of you in civil society, academia, those would just be some things I would offer on how to set them up for success, or at least even just how to approach pitching these types of partnerships. And completely agree with Laura's comments around the efficiencies in terms of always looking for that pathway of scale to reach as many people as possible with the same action.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Rosita. I want to swing over to Nate and Andrew for the first prompt, but first, a very quick question for you, Holly, from the audience. This is from Ratash, and how could they learn more about the process of becoming a member of the Development Data Partnership? Is there a website they can visit to learn more about that process, or an email address?
Yes, I won't go through the process here, but I'm so happy you asked. Just head over to datapartnership.org. And hey, Rosita, I hope PayPal is feeling some FOMO about the partnership and would love to join us, taking your advice.
Well played, Holly. I will pass over now to Andrew and then to Nate to respond a little bit to the question of what incentives drive private sector collaborations. Nate, you talked briefly about kind of some targets. I think you mentioned, policy impact, for instance, as one example. So yeah, what incentives drive private sector collaborations that support data or digital transformation for the SDGs? Let's start with you, Andrew, and then to Nate.
Awesome. Thanks, Samir. Yeah, the way I think about the incentives is that stakeholder pressure actually seems to be one of the largest changes in incentives that I've seen recently, right? Which is that stakeholders of all kinds, whether they be investors that are requiring, a better understanding of your ESG performance, whether it be your employees who are demanding that companies think about their social responsibilities in new ways, or the communities in which we work. We're being asked to be accountable for the impacts that we're having as companies. And I think that's actually a really good thing. And that stakeholder pressure really does matter. I want to say, coming from inside, a tech company, like organizing efforts, stakeholder pressure out in the public really does matter and drives change for many companies. And I think the nice thing about the SDGs is that they've simply provided a language and an understanding of what we're shooting for, right? Like, I think as many organizations, like what we want is targets. We want to know, like, what's good performance look like? What's the goal that we need to move towards? And so I think the SDGs have provided a really useful framework for doing that. But I think it's the stakeholder pressure that's providing some of that incentive. The other thing I would say, though, is that I do think it's really valuable when companies actually treat these areas as business opportunities. Because that just opens up a level of investment that's not available otherwise, right? Like, we have some amount of energy and resources and effort that we can direct towards, purely philanthropic efforts, brand building efforts, things of that nature. Those things matter, and those things are important, and they're oftentimes what is driving a lot of these data collaborations and this digital transformation work. But when organizations can find a way to make money and treat, sustainability, treat the social sector, treat, these kinds of areas in which the SDGs are operating as business opportunities, and actually can make revenue and make a sustainable business out of that, I think that's actually the greatest incentive for this work. Like, one of the reasons I came to Salesforce was that we do treat, the social sector as a market that we serve, right? We have 55,000 nonprofit and education customers. And the part of the reason I like that is that we're then able to invest, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into innovating for those customers. And if we can really find ways to help customers address their needs through data collaborations, through supporting their digital transformation, through supporting their use of data and technology to drive impact, that just means there's that much more money going into those kinds of efforts. So I think that's a really helpful incentive, but I don't want to undermine, like, stakeholder pressure matters. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that I've seen happen in the last few years, is just a real sea change in companies responding to a wider variety of stakeholders.
And I think us being at a place like this is precisely part of that process, right? To try to understand and connect with and even just demystify who we are to these stakeholders, bring them into the fold. Thank you. And over to you, Nate.
Yeah, great comments. It's a fun prompt. The first answer that comes to mind for me is leverage. So it feels like the technology sector has a reputation of believing that it can solve everything on our own. Just throw some engineers into a room and they'll come up with something brilliant. I think that the reality is we need partners in order to accomplish things that are important for our company's vision. So speaking first of LinkedIn, our vision is to create economic opportunity, and we can only do that for people that are connected to the internet, right? Like, we're a consumer internet company, so that's what we are, what we do. When we think about wanting to create opportunity, off platform, we really can't do that unless we partner with institutions that have the capacity and have the teams in place and the on-the-ground presence. And so the hope in contributing data assets to those types of partners is that they can do things that LinkedIn can't do, that they can take data on skills and education knowledge, for example, and they can use that to improve education systems in places where we're not present. So I think the first reason that we participate in these things is just leverage, just the acknowledgement of partners being able to do more together than either of us could do separately. The other thing that I'll mention, and this echoes what Andrew said as well, building trust with stakeholders, and it does help to have more voices coming in, the chorus that Laura described as well. Stakeholders for us, I don't know if anyone caught this, there's a great report that comes out that Edelman does. It's called the Trust Barometer. And one of the conclusions from the recent Trust Barometer is that different elements of society, it covered business, it covered government, covered NGOs and education sectors. The perception of each of those individual sectors improves when they work together. In other words, no single sector has an abundance of trust. But if business works with NGOs, if NGOs work with government, if we work together and not against each other's interests, then the perception from citizens, from members, from customers, even in the case of the private sector, improves. And so that makes it a little bit better for everyone. We recently had our CEO join with Special Envoy John Kerry, had a session on using LinkedIn data to help understand how economic skills and jobs are changing because of the needs of climate. And CEO walked off the stage and was surprised because he started getting a lot of messages from customers, messages from members saying how great it was that LinkedIn showed up in this place, talking about a topic that one wouldn't naturally associate with LinkedIn. So that kind of trust across stakeholders is important as a business imperative, and I think important as something that increases the perception from all of the constituents that we have as institutions, not just private sector, but also NGOs and multilaterals. So those are my two. I think leverage and then just building trust with stakeholders are the reasons that LinkedIn is excited about participating.
Thank you. That last one on trust, we haven't talked too much about, but it's so instrumental. I think that's definitely a cross-cutting theme. And when you erode that trust, that can be a real barrier. And so that's my sad segue to our final prompt, asking Kareem, what are some of the barriers that make these collaborations more challenging? We've only have about a minute or so left, Kareem, so I'll pass over to you.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. And I think I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record because we've heard some of these themes throughout the day from all of the other panelists. Of course, we need to do a better job of fostering a culture of mutual understanding and collaboration. On the humanitarian and development side, there's far too many of us who still don't necessarily understand or trust the private sector and fail to capitalize on the opportunities that can come from collaborating with businesses of every size. There's also far too many of us who lack basic knowledge and skills related to data and technology and aren't even aware of the resources and tools that can be brought to bear to solve some of these problems we've been struggling with for years. I think much of the same can be said for private sector partners, many of whom can be eager to engage with the UN and other actors to improve the world, but don't necessarily understand the way that global humanitarian and development systems work. So we need to improve that understanding on both sides, and panels like this are a great place to start. There's also a tendency for us to pursue partnerships when we're in the midst of an emergency, and this can be extremely difficult, if not impossible. No one can negotiate a data sharing agreement or try to navigate due diligence requirements in the midst of a crisis. Real partnerships take months, if not years, to establish and should be built on the basis of mutual benefit and a clear-eyed understanding of the specific context in which we are working. I'll maybe close with just another note on that trust. I think we need to do a better job of creating trust, not just between us, but also with the affected people who we are meant to be helping and whose data we are often making use of. We have to be very clear and committed to best practices in data responsibility, and we need to be a lot more transparent about the policies and procedures that we're using to protect the privacy and security of beneficiaries. I think that if we can address these three major buckets of issues, we'll be able to have much more effective partnerships.
Brilliant, Kareem. It's so hard to condense a really complicated prompt in about a minute, which you did very successfully. Thank you. And we have a notification here that the next plenary is starting. I'm going to probably wrap us up here. I really want to express my gratitude to all of you in the audience, all 141 who've tuned in today. It's really meaningful that you spend time with us today. Thanks to our panelists for preparing. We really hope that this is a start of the process of demystifying the tech sector and its role in the data revolution. We are super excited to be part of this important conversation and to be able to learn from you. And this is, again, just part of a broader conversation that we want to be part of. So with appreciation to all of you tuning in, to our panelists, we'll wrap up. I'm looking forward to the plenary session starting shortly. See you next time.